Welcome. This is a short history of the Abana Bell. Your invitation to visit the Church of St Andrew, Cleveleys. The proposal to move the Abana Bell means it will be moving into the body of the church. It means that you may personally connect with history and ring the bell. In honour and memory of the brave crews of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, who serve with courage, dependability, trustworthiness, with volunteers at their heart.
I'm going to tell you about the Abana Bell and the Abana shipwreck, but actually I'm going to start slightly earlier than the Abana, because on that day, on the day when the Abana was shipwrecked, there were actually 2 shipwrecks. So I'm going to tell you about that whole day. And the day is the 22nd of December, and it's 1894. Now, on the 22nd of December 1894, the people who lived in Blackpool and on the Fylde coast woke up to an enormous storm. The wind was raging. It said that chimney top pots were being blown off the houses, trees were coming down. It was really strong winds. It was freezing cold, it was icy. Folklore says that even the sand was freezing, which I don't think is actually possible, but that's what folklore says. But it was a really stormy day and the waves were crashing in. So it was really bad weather. The people who woke up to the sound of a bell. Not our bell, not the Abana Bell, but a different bell. They heard a deep tolling as they woke up. And when they went out to explore where this sound was coming from, actually it was from a bell that's on a buoy. You know, the kind of buoy that's out at sea that your ships hold on to. A buoy that had been in Morecambe Bay, but had broke loose from its moorings in Morecambe Bay and had been washed down and had got lodged underneath Ginn Square. So that's where it was. It was making this big ringing noise, and it was actually a buoy, or the bell on top of a buoy, that was at Morecambe Bay, or that had been at Morecambe Bay. So we start off with a bell ringing. About 1 o'clock in the afternoon is when our first shipwreck happens. The first shipwreck was a fishing smack. It was called the Petrel. The Petrel had gone just doing close water fishing, so not deep sea stuff, but just inland, and they'd gone fishing along the coast. I'm not really quite sure why they went fishing in such poor weather, but they had. There were a crew of 4, so a captain and 3 shipmates, and sadly the captain had got washed overboard. So there were 3 still on the boat. The 3, by now the boat was up quite close to North Pier. So the lifeboat was called, the lifeboat went out to rescue, and they managed to get all 3 of the men who were still on the boat to safety back at land. This was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So the lifeboat men had already been out once before they got the alert to go out to the Abana. Let me step back in time a little bit. 20 years earlier, the Abana was built in 1874, so the Abana Bell is 150 years old this year. We know that it was built in Canada because it says Abana and St John NB, which stands for New Brunswick in Canada. So we know exactly where it was built. In fact, St John's quite a small place. It's on the far eastern coast of Canada, and we know roughly even which street it was built in because there was only one shipbuilder at the time in that place. It was quite a small town. So we know exactly where the ship was built. The Abana Bell was only ever on the Abana ship. It was never on any other boat. So it had been built in 1874 and was built in Canada. It was sailing at the time of the shipwreck under the flag of Norway. So it had been sold to a Norwegian company and it was sailing under the flag of Norway. The captain was called Captain Adolf Danielson. So he was the captain and he had a crew of 16 men. Their job, the boat's job, was to sail sometimes to Norway, but most often from England to America and back across the Atlantic. And the journey that was to be its last journey, the fateful journey, was a journey over to America to pick up a timber cargo. So they were bringing back a whole load of timber. That meant that they were travelling initially to go out to America with nothing on board, apart from the men and the supplies that they needed. Now, I should tell you, as well as the 17 men, Captain Danielson and his crew of 16, there was also a dog and a cat on board. The captain took his dog with him, and the cat was the ship's cat. All ships had cats to keep the mice down. So those two were on board the boat as well as all the men. So their job was to go over, pick up some cargo in America and bring it back. What they did in those days was they used ballast. They used gravel and sand as ballast to keep the boat stable because it had nothing on it, so it wasn't heavy. So to keep it stable, they used ballast. Obviously nowadays they use air and things like that to keep boats stable, but in those days they used the gravel to make the ballast. So they'd set sail with the gravel. They'd set sail on the 20th from Liverpool, and their intention was to come up the coast towards us and then go out over the top of Ireland and out over to America across the Atlantic. That journey would have taken them a couple of months because they were completely reliant on sails. There was no engine, nothing like that. It was completely a sailing ship. It was a huge ship. If you look at the picture, this is a person. So you can see the relative scale, the size of the person next to the size of the ship. It was a huge ship. It had 3 masts, 3 tall ones with obviously the number of sails attached to it. So it was a big ship, and it was on its way going out into the Irish Sea, up over the top of Ireland, over into the Atlantic and on to America. When it set off on the 20th, the weather was really bad. It set off, but actually it pulled back in. Captain Danielson felt it wasn't safe to go, and it pulled back in. So it set off again on the 21st because the long-range weather forecast that they had in those days said that the weather was going to be better. So they set off on the 21st, but by the morning of the 22nd, the weather had really deteriorated again. Captain Danielson felt it was safe enough to keep going. So he carried on sailing up the Irish Sea towards us. Now, the ship was spotted as being in trouble at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It's still stormy, the winds are high. By this time it's high tide, and so the sea is high as well, lots of waves crashing, and it was obvious that this boat was in trouble. But how was it spotted? Well, they had the bell, so they would have been clinging the bell. They probably would have had fiery sticks and twigs that they were probably waving. Some of them were trying to control the sails, because if the sails are blown off, then they've got no control over the boat at all. So some of the men would have been trying to control the sails, and the boat was in trouble. Now, there was a man, and that man, his name is Robert Hindle. Robert Hindle lived here in Cleveleys. He lived, so far as we can tell from the history information we have, he lived where the Regal Hotel is now. So on that area, he was quite a wealthy man, and he owned some land, probably half of that road or something, we don't know, but he was quite a wealthy man. He liked watching storms, and he loved being on the beach. He spent a lot of time on the beach. So he'd gone down towards Blackpool, probably on horseback. He doesn't tell us how he gets there, but there weren't many cars around, so probably on horseback. He'd gone down towards Blackpool to watch the storm. At about 3 o'clock, he was the one who noticed this ship, and this ship was in trouble. And he was the one who noticed the ship was doing something incredibly dangerous. Because what had happened, the men on board the ship, bearing in mind they were Norwegian, they saw a light, and they assumed that that light was a lighthouse. But as you'll know, if you're from this area, we don't have a lighthouse in Blackpool. What they'd seen was Blackpool Tower, because the shipwreck happened the year that Blackpool Tower was built. So they saw the light at the top of Blackpool Tower. Now, they saw the light and thought it indicated safe passage, but that meant that they were coming closer to the rocks around the cliffs area. So actually, they were heading for even more danger than they were already in. So Robert Hindle went to get help, and he went to the lifeboat men. Now, remember, they'd already been out about 1 o'clock in the afternoon and rescued the fishermen from the Petrel. The Petrel was still lying there, shipwrecked. They'd got back in, got the men to safety, got back, stripped down, cleaned their boat, done all the things that they did, gone back off to whatever their jobs and their normal life was when they got the call to come back out again. And they bravely came back out again. Now, interestingly, they came out and they went back to where they'd launched from, which was around the Gyn, to get to the Petrel. But this time the waves were too high and they couldn't launch from there. So the boat was put onto a horse-drawn carriage, and it was pulled from North Shore, from Blackpool, all the way up through Bispam village to around where the Norbreck is now at Little Bispam. Now, the road it will have travelled on, because at that time there was no promenade road, that wasn't there. The grass and the rocks went up to the sea. So at that time, the only road roughly took the route of Whitegate Drive and Devonshire Road. Not completely, but roughly. Now, in Bispam, it veered, it didn't take the route it does now, it veered towards All Hallows Church, if you know where that is, because All Hallows Church was already there. So the road was only a single track road. It wasn't a big road by any means, but it went off through Bispam village and down towards All Hallows Church, rather than the route that we know now as the main road, Devonshire Road. So this horse-drawn carriage pulling the lifeboat came up through Bispam village and to around where the Norbreck Castle is, and that's where they managed to launch. Now, the lifeboat was in effect a huge rowing boat. There were 16 men, crew, there were no lady lifeboat people in those days, 16 men, and they were 8 on one side and 8 on the other side rowing. And that's how they went out to sea. So they're incredibly brave men going out to sea in a huge storm. By now it was 3:30, 4, 5, getting towards 5 o'clock at night, so it would be dark as well. And they went out in a rowing boat to try and rescue them. The ship by now, the Abana, it had been seen in trouble off the pier up at Blackpool, but by now it had been swept down and it was around the Anchor's area where it still lies today. So by now it was around that area. The ship was still at this point being tossed about from side to side. One of the masts had cracked on the side part, so now the sails were all torn and all down, and so it wasn't going anywhere. They couldn't control the direction the ship was going in now. It was at the mercy of the wind and the waves. The lifeboat men rowed up to it, and it said, there's a book called The Shipwreck Dispositions, and it said on that they threw ropes from the Abana down to the lifeboat, and the men sort of shimmied on down the ropes, climbing down the ropes. One of the men brought the cat with them. The dog allegedly jumped into the lifeboat, and every single man and the dog and the cat were all saved. Every single soul was saved by those brave lifeboat men. So the adventure wasn't over. The lifeboat men then had to get back to land. They were rowing back to land when they got stuck on a sandbank. Because of course now, instead of having the 16 of them, they had 16 of them plus 17 other men plus a dog plus a cat. So the boat was a lot heavier and down further in the water. The lifeboat men jumped out, pushed it off the sandbank, jumped back in and carried on sailing. So these are incredibly brave people who did this rescue, incredibly brave people. They got every single person safely back to land. When they got back to land, Robert Hindle was waiting for them. Robert Hindle was the guy who'd raised the alarm originally. He was waiting for them back in land, and he paid for them to stay at the Red Lion Inn. Now, the Red Lion Inn was where it is now, but it wasn't looking the way it looks now. It was facing the other way around. The front entrance was round the back because, of course, the main road, such as it was, went behind it. So it's not, although it is where it is now, it's not quite as it was. And this photograph shows all of the men, and right in the middle, you can just make him out, the ship's dog, the captain's dog. It was an Alsatian type of dog. They stayed there over Christmas. Whilst they were there, when the weather had calmed and the storm had gone, they went and rescued what they could off the ship. They rescued the front, you know, the name of the ship and the whatever the figurehead was on the ship. So that was rescued, and the bell was taken off the ship. The bell was given to Robert Hindle. So Robert Hindle was given the bell by the captain as a thank you for alerting the need and in effect helping to save their lives. So Robert Hindle was given the bell. He was also given the dog. The captain left his dog with Robert Hindle. We don't know exactly why. I've written this story for children, and in the story for children I've called him the ship's dog rather than the captain's dog, because I didn't think it was very nice, the captain just giving his dog away. So he's a homeless dog who lives on a ship, who then gets given away and has a safe home to make it nice for children. But yeah, so Robert Hindle had the ship's bell and the captain's dog. That's what he kept out of it. Now, this church wasn't built then, because this church was built in 1910. So this church, the people who worshipped here in those days worshipped actually just down the road at what is now the bus station. There was buildings there, and they worshipped above a post office. So that's where their worship was. And they were raising money to build the church. And obviously, as you can imagine, a church takes a little while to build. This church is incredible in their planning, in that there was no electricity in Cleveleys, but this church was built so that when electricity arrived in Cleveleys, it could be using the electricity. So it was built ready for electricity before there was any electricity in Cleveleys, which was incredible forethought, really. So the church was built, it was opened in 1910, and the bell was given to the church. Now, we don't know exactly where it was in all that time. Originally, it called people to worship, but we don't know where it was stored. When we did a reordering in 2001, the bell was put in the baptistry. Now, the baptistry is right in the back corner. I'll take you in there so you can see the bell and give it a ring. But the baptistry is the area where the original stone font is as well. So the two items were put together, the bell and the font, because, of course, the font is where the baptisms are done, and that's speaking of being saved, of new birth through water, through the waters of baptism. And, of course, the bell rang and alerted people to the danger so that the men could be saved from this ship. So both of them speak of being saved through water, and that's why they were housed together. They're not actually going to be together forever, because the bell is going to move. This year the bell is 150 years old, and we're moving it and putting it just where the hymn board is up there, so that it can be seen more, because even a lot of people who come to the church, because it's behind a door, you go in and out of the kitchen, you don't even know it's there. And we want the bell because it's a special piece of history. We want it to be seen. So it's going to be up on the wall there. And we're having a very special sea shanty night, as you know. Well, it's an afternoon, actually, where we're going to be singing, or we're going to be listening to lots of entertaining songs about sea shanties. And there's one that's been written about the Abana, especially for that event. So we're really looking forward to that. So you've heard the story of the Abana. I'm going to tell you about one more thing, though, just before you go, if you don't mind. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the window up at the top there. And I'm telling you about that this year, particularly because this year's been a very special year in terms of D-Day. And that window is dedicated to someone who died in the D-Day landings. His name is Frank Hastings Hardy, and Frank Hastings Hardy was in the Navy. He originally worked in Preston as a bank manager, and he joined up when the Second World War was announced. He went in the Navy, and he fought in a couple of different battles, and then he was part of the D-Day landings. Now, he was on one of the landing ships. So the big ships that couldn't get in too close to the beach, they would decant their people, their soldiers, onto landing ships that could get closer to the beach. The landing ships would bring them in towards the beach. They'd jump out of the boat and wade the rest of the way. So he was in charge in one of the landing ships. He was bringing men onto the beaches, and the men were getting out and going in, and they were under enemy fire during that time. And some of the men were injured in the water. So he got out, pulled them to safety on his boat, and he was taking them back to the main ship when his boat suffered a direct hit and everyone on board was killed. His family, his mum and his dad worshipped in this church, and so they arranged for that window to be put in. So it's a beautiful, beautiful window, and it has the words that are used often in funerals, "I go to prepare a place for you," written on it. And it's there in memory of Frank Hastings Hardy, who died as part of the D-Day landings. So it's just a lovely thing to tell people about as well, particularly in this special year. So we're going to go through and look at the bell, and if you'd like to, you're more than welcome to give it a ring. Keep going. Okay, follow me. Right into the corner here. The bell's behind the door, so I'll have to let you all in and shut the door. There we go. And right behind the door is the bell, the Abana Bell. You can see it says Abana on it, and St. John NB, NB standing for New Brunswick. All of the bell is original apart from this. Folklore says that it was a red leather strap. Whether that's true or not, who knows, but that's what folklore says, that it was a red leather strap. The bell still rings. Are you ready? Because it can be quite loud. But it's got a lovely tone, and the sound lasts and lasts and lasts. We do school trips now here, so all the children in Cleveleys, all the local schools, get the opportunity to come and learn the story about the bell. They learn the slightly different version where the dog belonged to the ship rather than the captain, but they learn the story of the bell, and they get to come and ring it as well, because it's incredible that we can touch something that is 150 years old, and we can ring a bell that was rung by those sailors 150 or 130 years ago as they tried to get help for their ship. Feel free, give it a ring.